Hey, and welcome back to Gaming for Tokens. In this episode, we're going to be talking about how to do a 2D scene, or how to set up a 2D game in Unity 3D. That means that we're going to start with nothing. That's why you can see here the project wizard again, which we haven't seen in a few videos. We're going to be setting up a 2D scene from scratch. We're going to be looking at the differences between the 2D and 3D cameras. Hopefully I'll be able to explain what sorting layers are and how those work. We'll also be looking at sprites, how to import those, how to handle them with the sprite editor, and some 2D physics, because there's some differences between the 2D and 3D physics, rigid bodies, and all that jazz. And then hopefully, if we can get into it, some 2D physics scripting, because I know that some of that stuff is also different. Not a whole lot. It's not different so much as it just uses different names and different... there are different things you have to call that do the same thing as stuff in 3D. So it should be pretty simple. But to get started, I'm opening up a Unity and going to Create New Project tab, just like we did before when we first started looking at Unity. And I chose a new path for my my project. And I'm not going to be importing any of these packages, I don't think. Well, I'll import the physical materials, just because we can play with those a little bit if we want. The rest of this stuff we will probably ignore. And I'm going to switch down here to 2D. So this is the first step into going from 3D to 2D. I know I kind of glossed over it in the intro video to Unity, but this is how you start it off. So what this is going to do is it's going to set the project up to have a bunch of default settings that are different than what they usually are for 3D. So it's going to default all the cameras to be 2D isometric cameras. It's going to default texture import settings to be for sprites, and what else? It might default sound import as well, so that the sounds aren't 3D sounds, they're 2D sounds, but I'm not sure about that. So yeah, let's just go ahead and jump right in and hit create. Okay, so here's Unity. It looks pretty familiar, except the camera looks a little different, because it's a 2D camera. So this is our scene view, as it were. So this is what we would normally look like this, and we could rotate around and stuff, is now looking like this. So the 2D checkbox, I guess it's a checkbox, I don't know, maybe, I don't know really what it is, it's a button. The 2D toggle button up here is checked by default. So that's our first big change. Our second big change you'll notice over here is that our camera is orthographic, and which we can see by selecting the camera in the 3D view and seeing that it's a big box instead of the normal like box cone kind of thing that we have going on, the perspective camera that we normally have. It's like this instead now. So it's a straight box. So what it means is that this is our view space. So if we drop a cube in here, which we can still do, cube, you'll see that the extent of the camera is about there, and as we move the box to the edge, it's to the edge down here. So see, edge, edge, edge. That makes sense. You'll notice that the plane that you're working in now is the XY plane, which is kind of how you want to be working. You wouldn't want to work on the Z plane, because the way that physics works, remember, is it falls down. So down is still down, up is still up, right is still right, and left is still left, but there is no forward backward effectively in this. So that's the kind of the first part of that. There's not much to the cameras. It's just an orthographic view. I mean, you can change it back to perspective if you want and go to 3D, and suddenly we're making a 3D game again. But it's for the purposes of this, obviously, we're going to stick with orthographic. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was the layers, the sorting layers, which are kind of confusing because we haven't... They're not under graphics. Oh, where are they? Oh, crap. I think they're under... Oh, they're under render settings, aren't they? No, they're under... Oh, God, they're under layers, I think. Where are layers? Input, tags and layers. Right there. Sorting layers are right here. So I guess sorting layers aren't exclusively for 2D, but, well, maybe they are. You know what? I might come back to the layers in a second, because I just realized that we have to import stuff in. So I'm going to go ahead and open up this. So this is our assets folder, and I'm going to copy a bunch of stuff over. So this is my default file structure that I have saved on my computer, And under textures, which we can rename to sprites because it's not textures anymore, they're sprites, which are basically the same thing, but it's just game terminology. That's really all it is. And we're going to import a couple sprites in. These are just textures that I had laying around and then one that I made. So once we have all this stuff in here, we're gonna come in here, it'll import all of it, and we have in our sprites folder sprites. So you guys may recognize this guy. If you are familiar with Mega Man. This is the sprite sheet from Zero. It's a sprite sheet for Zero from Mega Man that I found online somewhere. So there are a couple options here that are different. So normally when you select the texture, here, and I'll change this one to texture so that you can kind of see how it looks normally. So this is how it looks when you import a texture in. Do you want an alpha from grayscale? Do you want transparency? Yada yada. Stuff that we've already talked about. When it's a sprite, on the other hand, it asks you how many, what kind of sprite is this? Is it just a single sprite, or is this a sheet of sprites? How are we going to pack these? How many pixels to in-game units is it? So in this particular case, there is 100 pixels to every 1 unit. So this texture is 256 by 256. So that means that this is effectively going to be about 2.5 units wide and tall, if that makes sense. So, oh yeah, apply it, I guess. So this box is a 1 by 1 box. So in other words, that sprite, if I just imported it in, is going to be about that wide. And you'll see that if I drag and drop this over here, it's about that wide. See? Magic. So, again, I just kind of drag and drop that in. I'll get to that in a second. So anyway, that's what this means over here, the pixels to units. So whatever this is, so if we decrease this number, then the sprite's going to be bigger. Oh, yeah, we need to apply and then it come over. So now it's bigger because it's 50 to 1 instead of 100 to 1. So that's kind of what that means. The pivot is, where do you want the pivot? Do you want it as I showed you in the middle? So this is right here's the pivot of the object. Do you want that in the center? Do you want it any of these different locations? You can have a custom one, so you can put the pivot wherever you want. The pivot's basically, where is it going to rotate around? Where is it? Where is the center of the object? If you're familiar with 3D programs, like 3D modeling programs and things like that, you can usually move the pivot of objects around. That's how you set the pivot on a sprite. Because you can't edit it in the editor, necessarily. Okay. And then your normal filter mode. So like point, trilinear, that kind of thing. The same thing on texture sheets that you get. And then what's the max size of the texture sheet? So for this one, I'm going to say it's 256. And I'm going to hit apply. This setting is going to be on every one of the texture types, I believe. This is your quality settings, basically. So in this particular case, it is going to be a center, or a center pivot with a single sprite, because these two are just. Oh, and I'm also gonna change that back to 100. Because I mean that's just the way, that's what it is. It's a single sprite, and it's that's the way it is. So that's going to be the same for all three of these. This one is also going to be the same, and this is the really, really crappy rush job like environment that I made. So if I drag this over, in theory, it should be big enough to work in the environment, because I made it 1280 by 720, which is a 16 by 9 format. So what I have to do is I have to figure out how many pixels to how many units in game that means, and that's going to be rough, and I don't know what that is exactly. I'll go 150. No, I'll go 50. Uh-huh. So yeah, I don't know exactly what that is, but 75 will be about accurate. 75 is close enough. It might be 60. Oh, no, it's 72 because I made the thing 72 DPI. So that makes sense. 72. So, that's interesting. Okay, cool. So I just learned a thing. When I made this image in Photoshop, I started off with the image being 72 DPI. And that's effectively what this little thing over here is. That means dots per inch if you're not familiar with Photoshop. If you are familiar with Photoshop, that's going to make a lot of sense. But basically, this is going to be the DPI. This is how many pixels are there in every unit. And that's essentially what they are in Photoshop, the DPI. How many pixels are there per inch. So I made it 72 DPI in Photoshop. So I should make it 72 DPI here, and it'll be the same size across both programs. So that's really handy and interesting. That's cool. I like that. Anyway, so this is going to be our really crappy environment that I threw together. And I'll change the background color to be an equally crappy color. Perfect. Isn't that just vomit worthy? Great. So once we have this in, this is going to be a big texture, so we're going to edit that. And then we have a sheet. So the way that we handle sheets is we change this from single to multiple. You'll see that it brings up a button. It's like, hey, you change this to multiple, so you can edit the sprites, and it'll open up a new window that looks like this. And this window is pretty cool. So you can define sprites by dragging and dropping, or we can do an if you click up here, there is an options menu, and you can do automatic. So you can automatically slice a bunch of sprites out of this. So if we say the minimum size is 4, and the pivots are always going to go to the center of the sprite, and we're going to delete the existing ones because I have one in here that I don't like, and we hit slice, it's going to go through and it's going to find the how do I describe this? It's going to find each individual element on the texture. So it's going to come in here and it's going to find a pixel that's being used, and it's going to find every pixel that's connected to that pixel, and it's going to link those all together. So all these little boxes here are all sprites, and it just knows where they are. So we can identify those, and they're all named zero. Whatever the name of the texture is, this is zero sheet is the name of the texture. So it's zero sheet 1, 0, 1, 2, 3, yada yada yada, and all the pivots are in the center. If we wanted to, we can trim it, and that'll bring it down to whatever the default is here, and I'll show you how that works. So if I drag and drop, if I drag one in here and then I hit trim, it'll trim out all the excess space. Kind of what it did automatically for us, but yeah, just different, I guess, like a different way of going about it. So yeah, it's 90. This should be 91. I screwed up my naming convention because I was messing around. So also we have the position on the texture sheet that it is and how big it is. So that's the XY is where is the sprite, and how wide and how high is the sprite. So if we change this to top left, you'll see that the pivot changes at the top left. Sorry, that's like an aside. That's not related to this at all. So there's our position, there's our width, and this will change our pivot, is what I was saying. So once this is done, we can just kind of close this and hit apply. And now you'll notice that we have a crap load of sprites. Now because this is pixel art, and I'm assuming, because of the way that the indie games market is, that if you're looking at a 2D tutorial, you're going to want to probably know how to do pixel stuff or one-to-one. So if you look at this, it's blurry as hell, and it's blurry because it's sampling it, right? We have a filter mode. We're filtering it. Every one pixel is blended into the next pixel, is what bilinear means, I believe. So if we change this from that to point, that basically means that every pixel is going to be a one-to-one. It's going to look blurry in here, but it won't look blurry in here. So we'll notice that as we zoom in, hey look, it's not crappy looking. But I believe if we change this to bilinear, it'll be, yeah, you'll see how it's blurred out and it looks like crap. So well, sort of, I mean, the game thinks it looks good. This is how it should look, I guess, is a way of saying it, because that's how 0 looks. So there is our sprite. Now, again, we'll notice he's really tiny in our environment, so maybe we want to make him also 72 DPI to match our environment. That'll make him a little bigger. And we can even decrease this further. So what is it? That'd be 36 is half of that? Yeah, I'm not crazy. 36 is half of that. So now he's double the size. So now we have our sprite dude, and he matches our, well, matches our environment, right? No, he matches our environment in size and in I don't know, in space or whatever. So we have all these different sprites in here, and we can do what is it called? We can do an animation with this, but the animation system that it uses is rather finicky, and I personally don't like the way that you have to do sprite animation in Unity. I think it's really silly. I'm also changing this to point, by the way, so that it gives us a nice crisp line, because before it was not. Sorry, this is kind of I'm doing multiple things at once and I shouldn't be. So notice that this is kind of blurred out. I don't really like that. I want a nice crisp line, because I did vector for a reason on that, and now I have a nice crisp line. And we'll see that because of the way that the sorting layers work, well, okay, so this is a good time to mention sorting layers. You'll notice that on the sprites here, so on this sprite, for example, we have a sorting layer. It's default. So if we hit add sorting layer, we want to put in one that's called environment. And then we want to assign this the sorting layer of environment. The reason why we want to do that, and you'll see that it kind of, so if you look over here on the left, you'll see that his foot is in front of the environment, and I'll exaggerate this by, I'll exaggerate this by moving him under the environment a little, and then selecting him. If I choose environment, he goes behind it, which isn't really what we want. Typically speaking, in 2D games, you're going to have a few layers. You're going to have a foreground, a background, a midground, and then your character layer. And your character layer is going to be above everything except for your foreground. And then your UI is going to be on top of that, usually, on top of everything. But, so from highest to lowest, so in other words, from what is on top, from what is to what is behind the most, you're going to have UI, foreground, character, midground, background, and you might have multiple types of those layers, so you might have like 3 background layers to get some parallax going on. But typically speaking, all you really need is 4 layers. You need a foreground, midground, background, and a character layer in front of your midground. And I'll kind of sort of be able to show you that a little bit. So we assign the terrain to our environment layer, but we want our character to be in front, so we're going to create a new sorting layer, and we're going to hit this little plus here to create a new one, and we're going to call this characters. And I mean, if we go over here and we assign him to characters, he's going to be in front of it now. And the reason why he's going to be in front of it, I thought he was going to be behind it, actually, to be perfectly honest, but that's how you get things to go in front or behind, is just by clicking on these and dragging them around. And we want our characters to be in front. So I guess the lower this is, the closer it is to the camera, if you think about it like that. So it's the bottom up is the order in which it top down is the order in which it renders, which means that things are rendering on top of other things in that order. Sorting layers have always been kind of a pain. Like, how do you have a list where things are rendered this one, this one, this one, but then you see them this one, this one, this one? Like, you see them from the bottom up, but they're sorted from the top down in the rendering engine. It's kind of bizarre, but that's what's going on there. And then obviously we can create a couple more. We can create a foreground, and we can create a midground. Oh, well, capitalizing everything else, we might as well capitalize that one too. And we'll have a background layer. Background. So the background is obviously going to go last. The foreground is obviously going to be in the front, because that's going to be like, a lot of games do this thing now where they have stuff like the character passes behind things to simulate depth, which is really cool. I really like that. So that's what this is simulating right now. But then we have this midground. We also have environment, so we actually have more than 4 layers in this particular case because I feel like being fancy. And our midground is going to go between our environment and characters. So midground is going to be things like props in the environment. We want those to be in front of the environment, but we don't want the player to pass behind them necessarily. So if we wanted props that we could put in front of the player as well as behind the player, we could do a midground rear and a midground front. So midground front. And then we put this on either side of the character. So that way we can still have stuff that is in the midground that is not in the foreground necessarily. So the foreground enters on top of the midground front, because there's midground is just props, right? So that makes sense. But then our character kind of can go between props, which can be kind of cool. And then once all this is set up, we can just like drag and drop this in here, and we can put this as, say, the background. So now it's background. Or we can change it to the midground rear, which means it's in front of the terrain, but behind the player. Or the midground front, which puts it in front of the player and the terrain, but not in front of the foreground. So we kind of have a way to do simulated depth, because that's a big deal with the 2D stuff. Is 3D is quote-unquote real depth, right? Like it's perspective, so things that are in front of other things cull things behind them. But the thing with 2D is that you want a stylized version of that. So some of the good examples being, I'm using Mega Man as an example. In Mega Man X and things like that, you end up having this the parallax effect is what I was talking about. Just so if you don't know what parallax means, it means things in the foreground moving slower than things, or moving faster than things in the background. So you have the background slowly panning to the left and right when you move your character, but the foreground is really moving in the front, because that's how perspective kind of sort of works. And it's to imply that the background is farther away than the foreground. Mega Man X does a lot of that, and that's something that we can totally do in this. It's fairly easy to do. We're not going to be doing it in this example because I just don't have the stuff to do it, and it's kind of superfluous. And if you've seen all the videos, then you should know how to do that already, actually, to be perfectly honest. But anyway, so that's kind of how sprites work. I'm not going to cover the animation for it, but if you want to dig into it, you have to use the where is it? Window. Is it animate? No, it's the animator, I believe. You have to use the animator, and this is kind of a mess. In my opinion, it is. I don't like it at all. You need an animation controller, I think. And then it's like a weird node-based editor thing that has to do with states, and you have to feed. You have to create your own classes and stuff to be able to feed. To be able to set booleans and integers and stuff into this to be able to tell it to do certain animations. I find it extremely annoying, because it used to just be that you could create animations and then assign them in a list form to a thing. So you could just go component, where is it? Miscellaneous? Yeah, animation, and then you could just have animations on an object and tell it which one to play. But apparently people wanted to be able to blend animations on 3D models, so you wanted to be able to like have a run where you could also turn the torso while you were running, which makes sense, but I feel like it's weird that we wanted that same system for doing sprite animation. It just seems kind of bizarre to me. I'm hoping that they fix it in Unity 5 or do something to make it a little more simple to do animations for sprites, because typically speaking, you could just make an animation using the animation window, which is this. So there's the animation window and the animator window, and they're different. And again, this is like, why is this a thing? They should be either the same thing or named very differently, but they're not. And normally what you could do is just you do this, and then you say sprite add curve. Yeah, sure. And then you do sprite renderer sprite, and then you hit the little plus sign, and then you're keying the sprite, and then you can just move this to a timeline and then say, hey, now you're sprite 2, and you can drag this along, and then you can say, now we're sprite 3, and now we're sprite 4, and now we're Sprite 5. And this is how I would prefer to animate in Unity, do animations in Unity rather. So now that when we do this, in theory, we could hit play and it would play the animation, but it doesn't because it's broken, because this doesn't work for sprite animation. But this is how you would do animations in Unity. It makes me sad that it doesn't work. So that's kind of a long-winded explanation to why I'm not going to be covering the animator. I don't know a lot about it, and I've only ever gotten it successfully working a few times, and it's kind of convoluted. Basically, you have to create states, and then you have to link states to things like a node-based editor, like we've kind of covered. But then you can also, like, what is it? Yeah. You have to sign like exit times and things like that, so that this can go into this state, and like this state needs to play a certain animation, and then because any state needs to play an animation. So I think it's annoying. You can bust into this if you want to. Again, that's under Window Animator, not Animation, Animator, and yeah. So if you want to play with that, you can. More power to you. I encourage you to. I absolutely want you to. Oh yeah, you need a controller in order to do that. So you go to Create Animator Controller, and then you can select that when you have the window open. You can edit the thing. So yeah, you can edit the controller in that window. Sorry, I don't know a whole lot about the animator, and it kind of bothers me that they did it that way. So going back to sprites though, we need this, like, I'm going to delete the 0 sprite now that we've gotten our use out of him, and we're going to do an interesting little thing here. So I have a circle, and I have a hexagon, and I have a square, and I'm actually going to take all of these, and I'm going to change this to be 256, because I know that all of these textures are 256 by 256. So what I'm saying is that the circle is now going to be 1 unit big. I'm going to set it at the top of this, and we're going to do the same kind of thing that we did for the rigid body system, but we're going to do it for 2D instead of 3D. So what we need is we need a bunch of rigid bodies, and we need some colliders, and we need some other stuff. But being we're in 2D, they're different. So here's what we do. Component, not physics, physics 2D. So this is where all of our physics 2D stuff is. You'll notice that there's more stuff in physics, like we have cloth sim and hinge joints and all that stuff for physics. We still have hinge joints and stuff in here, but they're not, they're clearly not the same. We also don't have a mesh collider anymore, like we do in here, because these aren't using meshes anymore, they're using sprites. So we can't have a mesh on a sprite. That doesn't make any sense. Those are two conflicting things. So instead we have a polygon collider. We also don't have the really, really strange wheel collider or the terrain collider. Well, I don't think we have the capsule collider either. Yeah. So what we do have is we have an edge, we have a box, we have a circle, and we have a polygon. So for this sprite, we're going to want an edge collider. Physics 2D, edge collider. Are we going to want that? Oh, right. I remember this now. Multiple? No. Okay. So we don't want... Oh, man. We're going to want a polygon collider for this. Okay. So an edge collider is really, really interesting, and I like it a lot, and it's used for... terrain usually. So, like, generally it'll collect the top edge of something. For some reason, I've got it to work in the past. I don't remember exactly how to use it. I ended up using a polygon collider instead, which looks like this. So I'm going to remove the edge collider. What the polygon collider does is it creates a polygon that it uses as the collider instead. So you'll see it there. These are all vertices. I'm kind of concerned about how this is going to turn out. That looks like a mess. But can we change anything in the collider info? Nope. Alright, well, there you go. So there's our collider for that. And then we're going to put, obviously, a circle collider on this. Physics 2D, circle collider. And we'll notice it doesn't exactly match, so we can tweak the radius if we care. I'm going to put 0.45. 0.46. 0.46 looks almost dead on. Sweet. So there's our collider there. So likewise, we're going to put a component, physics 2D, rigid body 2D. So a lot of this stuff looks the same, right? We have our trigger on our collider. We have the radius on our... this is effectively a sphere collider, but it's a circle. So we have that. We have where the center of it is, just like we always would. We even have our physical materials like we did on the 3D colliders. So the rigid body here uses a lot of the same stuff: mass, linear drag, angular drag, gravity, yada yada yada. It has also a sleeping mode, which is different. So sleep is a on 3D rigid bodies. It's a code thing. You can tell a rigid body to go to sleep via script, and what that means is that it'll stop calculating the physics on the object. This has just a starting mode. Do you want it to never sleep? Do you want it to start awake? Do you want it to start asleep? So that's kind of a handy little thing that's on the 2D rigid body that's not on the 3D rigid body. Oh. And then the other thing is collision detection, which we've seen before. So if we hit play, we're going to expect this to fall and roll down the hill. Perfect. And we'll see that because the polygon collider is great, it actually matches the contour of our terrain. So we're going to go ahead and throw a physical material. So we don't actually have any physical material 2Ds. I kind of thought that was going to be a thing. And we don't actually have... That was all the physical materials that we have. So that is news to me. So apparently I don't have any physical material 2Ds. Can we create one? Physical 2D material. Sweet. Bouncy 2D. We're going to create a physical material. I've never actually done this before. So we're going to crank the bounciness up to 10 and see what 1 and see what happens. And then this is also going to be like 0.2. And we're going to slap that on here and see what happens. Oh, well. There. Great. So now it should, yeah, it's going to bounce. And it's going to bounce right off the screen. So apparently, yeah, you can just create your own physical materials whenever you want. And physical material 3D has a lot more stuff on it. I probably should have covered this in the video. I just never even thought to. So yeah, you can make your own physical materials for 3D and 2D. 2D is much simpler, clearly. It only has two things as friction and bounciness. So if we increase the bounciness to 0.5, or the friction to 0.5, and we bring the bounciness back down to 0, we should see that it will slowly go down the hill, build up speed, and then slowly come back down. And we can even, we'll make this like a, I don't know, a frictiony, like a big heavy rubber ball. So, well, not a big heavy ball, but a dense rubber ball. So we'll take the mass up to 5 and see what happens. So now it's got a high mass, so it kind of will build up inertia and build up inertia, and then there we go. So doing rigid body stuff in 2D is pretty simple. If we're going to do scripting on physics stuff, we're going to need to do some extra stuff, because there's, again, just like there's this whole physics 2D thing, there's like a whole rigid body 2D setup, I believe, and you have to do collider 2D to do that kind of stuff, to access the collider on objects. It's loading up here, but it's usually just whatever the physics calls you were trying to get to do in 3D, you would just add 2D at the end of it instead. So for example, on update here, we could do if physics 2D dot raycast or dot linecast. Now the thing is that there isn't a sphere cast anymore, but I think there might be a overlap circle. Yeah, there's some different things in here. There's also all layers, whether or not we want to use all layers or not, which is kind of strange. There's all sorts of interesting things in here. So like we can edit the 2D gravity, for example, or ignore layer collision, that kind of thing. Linecast, overlap area, so you can define two specific points and it'll create a box based off that point. And you'll notice it uses vector 2s, not vector 3s, because again, we're using 2D space. It's X, Y, not XYZ. So you define a point in space and another point in space. It'll draw a box being the top left corner and bottom right corner, and it will see if anything is overlapping in that area, and it'll return a collider 2D, and that will be probably a list of all of the objects that it found. Oh no, this is the single object. This is the first object that it found, and this is all of the objects that it found. So there you go. Yeah. So there's all sorts of fancy stuff in here for you to check out and look at. There is still raycast, like I said, there's still linecast and all that stuff, but yeah, so Physics 2D is your place to go for 2D physics. I believe there is Rigid Body 2D, like I was saying, and you can access like add force and torque and all that stuff. And you'll notice that, again, these are all taking vector 2s, not vector 3s. So a rigid body, a normal rigid body, a 3D rigid body, takes vector 3 for force, because it's three-dimensional positional coordinates. Well, I guess three-dimension directional coordinates is what it's taking. So in a rigid body 2D, you have other stuff. Other things that it's interpreting a different spatial level, I guess, a different spatial dimension. A lack thereof of one of them, I guess. So again, we still have fixed angles and everything that we would have in a rigid body 3D, but it's all 2D stuff. So pretty straightforward. There's not a whole lot to really say about the differences here. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that is wonky with it. I think on my if statement here is freaking out my autocomplete. My half completed if statement. So delete that. And then we say on void on collision enter. I believe will still work for detecting 2D, 3D collision. I think it works across both. On mouse enter, on mouse down, all that stuff still works for 2D colliders. And just to make sure, I will say void on mouse enter debug.log entered. Great. And then I'm going to say on mouse down click void on mouse no down click, and if we throw these on the object, they'll work just like we would expect them to. Oh, give me the script on the thing. Boop. And then we hit play, and then on theory, when we enter this, it'll say entered, and then if we click on it, it'll say click. So again, all that stuff works, across both. So scripting for 2D, 3D is actually probably kind of sort of the same. If anything, it's a little simpler because you don't have to keep track of a vector 3s, it's just vector 2s. So for some people, that'll be weird if you're only ever used to vector 3s like I was. It'll be kind of weird going down to that. It really threw me off at first. Because some of the stuff, like there isn't... Because this is still using the transform class, it still has a z coordinate. So everything, if you want to get positions of things, it's all still vector 3s. Which is strange. So like sometimes you're going to be using vector 3s and sometimes you're going to be using vector 2s. You'll have to go back and forth between them. And if you're trying to modify things by vector 2s, you're going to have to convert those vector 2s to vector 3s, or your vector 3s to vector 2s. So you're going to have to drop coordinates, and like it can get kind of a hassle. Get to be kind of a hassle, that is. So a heads up there when you're doing stuff with that. But basically 2D stuff is pretty straightforward. You import your sprites in, you add your stuff just like you would if it was 3D, and you go to town. The only weird thing, like I was saying, was the animation stuff and setting up the sprite sheet, the sprite editor here, which isn't that bad, to be perfectly honest. I mean, it's pretty automated. If you want a I just realized this, if you want a grid, that's also an option. You define the size of the grid and it'll do a 64 by 64 grid. I think I set this one up to be 32 by 64. No, I set this one up weird and bad. But if you are a pixel artist and you know what you're doing, when you're in Photoshop, you will actually create a grid in Photoshop that you'll build all your pixels in, or all your pixel sprites in, and you will, I guess all of your sprites in general probably should be like this. And so each sprite will have its own box that it's built in, and then this way you can just say, okay, this is that sprite, and you can name it whatever you want when you import it. Like I said, I got this sprite sheet from the internet, and it was poorly made. So automatic works just fine. The problem with using automatic is that if you're using a, if you're trying to get the coordinates of the thing, so like, oh, what am I trying to say? So because the pivot is in the center of all of these, the position is always going to come from the center, and if the left and right and up and down change because of the size of the pixels, so like this one is taller than this one, so the position for this is going to be different than the position for this if the bottom of the sprite is on the terrain, if that makes sense. So like if the bottom of if this sprite is sitting on the terrain, so the bottom of this sprite is sitting on the terrain, the position of this is going to be higher than the position of this. And the way that you get around that is when you do the automatic thing is instead of hitting the center, you set the bottom, and then you hit slice, and now all the pivots are on the bottom regardless of how tall the sprite is, and that way you can define the position based off of, you can ground all of these sprites to the ground instead of on the center of the thing, which will help a lot. Also, these ones clearly, oh oops, I keep trying to select things like that and I can't. These things, obviously their pivot shouldn't be on the bottom, it should probably be on the right, so you can just define that as be on the right, and you get to also be on the left is where you, no, I guess it is on the right, isn't it? Because that's the back. Okay, yeah, so just making sure. Oh, to navigate in here, by the way, it's center click to pan, and then left click to create a sprite, and then right click also pans, I guess. And you can just select sprites and delete them if you want. Pretty straightforward. But yeah, so the sprite editor is new, and sprites are new, and 2D can be finicky at times because this is actually the first version of Unity to have 2D, so it's kind of it's a new thing. That's kind of why it is the way it is. I've had recently a chance to look at Unity 5, and man, is it different. So it's heartbreakingly different for this series, because that means that I'm gonna have to do an entire video and stuff on here's all the differences from Unity 4 to 5, and my god, you're learning a new program. Which is kind of, well, okay, it's not that bad. I mean, it still looks like this. There's just a lot of new stuff, and the whole project wizard has changed. And so the reason why I'm mentioning this is because this idea of being able to select a 2D drop-down and then go straight into making a 2D game, they kind of went overboard with it, I think. And they have a bunch of options in the beginning, so you can set it up for, do you want to build an endless runner? Well, here's an endless runner. Do you want to build a 2D game? Because you can build a 2D game, you can also build a 3D game, you can also build this kind of game and this kind of game. So it's like, wow, there's a lot of options, which means that there's going to be a bunch of default setups and a bunch of scripts that come default in Unity in the future that are cool, that set you up to do neat things. But anyway, I feel like I'm kind of rambling, and that's basically all there is to know about 2D stuff to get started. And feel free to expand on it and ask me questions and yell at me if I did things wrong, because people have been doing that lately, and it's good, because I want people to know how to do things. I don't want to be right. I don't want to be sounds weird, but I don't want to be a teacher necessarily. I want to be a student with everyone else, and I just want to share what I know. So if I did something wrong, by all means, let me know in the comments, and I'll comment on it, and I'll like your comment, so hopefully it'll go to the top, because it'll be one of the top comments, and people can see it, and we can educate each other too, and I think that's really cool. Because I don't know everything, and I'm not perfect. I'm the first to admit that. So, yeah. Cool. Well, thanks for watching, and bye-bye.